understand any better if somebody specified the class of well-formed formulas, and furthermore, nobody knows how to do it. Furthermore, every working linguist, here to get back to Luigi's point, every working linguist knows, at least on one side of his brain, that it doesn't make any sense, because working linguists are typically working in areas of relative judgment. Like most productive work has to do with things like the differences between subjacency deviations and ECB deviations, two kinds of deviation. That's, what's going to be useful evidence is never known in advance. It's usually something very exotic, not what's in front of you. And that evidence turns out, for theoretical reasons, to be extremely illuminating. So it takes the study of parasitic gaps, certain kind of constructions, which are very odd. When you tell them to people, they kind of cringe, although they interpret them in very special ways. Now, the ways to interpret them are extremely illuminating. In fact, precisely because they're very odd. They're very odd because nobody ever hears them. So any way they're interpreting is something that's coming out of their mind. So they happen to be very interesting, but they're all deviant. Well, are they well-formed or aren't they well-formed? Well, it's a stupid question. They have exactly the status they have. The status they have is deviant in this respect. There is no notion of well-formedness. Now, every working linguist knows that in their bones. No one has ever proposed. It's a vague idea what the class of well-formed formulas might be. There's no gap in linguistic theory that is asking to be filled by this concept. In other words, the concept has all the earmarks of being totally absurd, yet there's a huge literature based on it and claiming that there are all sorts of problems because weak generative capacity is too large, or quantity-type indeterminacy problems, and so on. That seems to be a really paradigm example of irrationality coming from misunderstood mathematical analyses, which aren't analogies. Actually, I think they're similar to back to Frege. But the model of formal arithmetic is just irrelevant. It's not at all like natural language. Formal mathematical languages are languages only by metaphor. Like the B language is a language. You can use the metaphor like they don't have any of the properties of natural language.
The other question is, you have emphasized the importance of the new revolution, the present revolution, saying that it's not really a revolution, and maybe it's misguiding or misinterpreting all ideas. I agree with that, and I think it's very, very interesting. My question is, do you think about some explanation about that? Because it seems to me as a very important misguiding of our society.
Well, I'd like to come back to that, actually, after giving some examples. It seems to me that from the very start, there were some very funny moves made with regard to, people tried to, they were trying to get out of behaviorism, but I think they fell right back into it. They fell right back into it in another direction by setting up operational criteria that defined categories of intelligence. So take say, Herbert Simon, who's, really one of the great figures of the field. Actually won the Nobel Prize for this kind of stuff. He pointed out once in his autobiography, he points out, and he's quite right, that chess playing algorithm, the problem of chess playing, is, he called it the Drosophila of cognitive science, meaning it plays the same role in cognitive science that Drosophila played in genetics. It's the core problem around which everything revolves. You wanted to solve the problem of Drosophila, that led to genetics. You wanted to solve the problem of chess playing, that led to cognitive science. And he's kind of right about that. People take it very seriously. And there's a lot of work on it, a lot of money goes into it, and so on. Back in the 50s, when this stuff got started, my view was, and I still hold this view, that this is total nonsense. Total and absolute nonsense. It doesn't make the slightest bit of difference whether you can get an algorithm that'll defeat Kasparov, or whoever it was in those days. The only purpose in working on this topic is if you want to take the fun out of playing chess. It's about as interesting as trying to show that you can build a bulldozer that'll dig a hole faster than a person. Probably you can. But it's going to tell you anything. It's going to tell you anything about human beings. And for reasons that every natural scientist knows. I mean, it has to do with the nature of simulation, you know. You don't do simulation in order to try to beat the original. You do simulation in order to try to learn something about the original. Okay? So, like, if somebody came along and said, the way to study human physical capacity is to build bulldozers, because they can dig holes faster than people can, that would be a joke. I mean, there would be a point in studying, you know, digging machines, for scientists at least, if it was going to teach you something about how humans dig. You just want to dig faster, you have engineering problems, nothing to do with sciences. A chess playing program would be interesting if it would tell you something about how people play chess. Actually, in my opinion, even that wouldn't be interesting. And the reason is that how people play chess is not an interesting problem. Now, interesting is a funny notion. You know, what is it of interest for the sciences is something something's interesting for the sciences if it's on the borders of current understanding. If it's way out away from the borders of current understanding, it's not interesting. It doesn't matter what's going on. Now, chess playing is not on the borders of current understanding. I mean, you know, it's some very, in fact, the reason chess is a game is because people are no good at it. If everybody was good at it, it wouldn't be a game. The things we're good at are things like talking. You can't have, you know, a thing like they just had in Yugoslavia where people speak sentences to each other and understand each other. The trouble is every 3-year-old can do that, you know. So you make up this, in fact, games and sports altogether are designed to be things that people are no good at all, you know. So therefore abilities separate, scatter, and only freaks can do it. Like pole vaulting. I mean, they don't have a walking, you know, you don't have a walking. You see people can walk from here to there in the Olympics, but you do see if they can pole vault, because it's some totally insane activity that nobody is any good at, and therefore abilities scatter, and only certain people can do it, and in fact only pretty freaky people can do it. So you can have sports and competitions and so on. Well, chess is like that. It's a game because we're absolutely no good at it. It's probably around the outer edges of the problem space. Now, it's not a mystery, or we'd be in real trouble, but it's not central to the problem space, and therefore it's a game. So therefore, yeah, and it doesn't make sense. Like, if you were studying human physiology, and somebody said, look, I want to study pole vaulting. What people actually study is how I reach over here and pick up that glass. That's unsolved, you know. Like, how to build a robot arm that'll duplicate what I do with, you know, tied to a visual system that'll do what I do when I pick up that glass. That's an interesting problem because it's around the borders of understanding. But if someone were to come along and say, I want to study pole vaulting, people would laugh. It's not worth studying. We don't even know how you can reach and pick up a glass. So who cares about pole vaulting? And the same is true of chess. I mean, it's so far from what we understand that it's nothing worth studying. But if for some crazy reason, I think it's crazy, somebody wanted to study it, then they would only be interested in chess-playing algorithm if, in fact, it taught you something about how people play chess. But it was obvious in the 1950s that that's not where it was going to go. The chess-playing algorithms that were going to win the prizes were those that used the capacities of computers, which are completely different than humans. They use rapid search, for example. So the guys who win the prizes now are people who explore some search space, you know, at very super speeds down to 10 moves, you know. Well, human beings can't begin to do that. And not begin. Humans do it in a totally different way, however it is. So, you know, winning the chess championship, like what gets money in the articles in the science magazines, is like building a bigger bulldozer. And if that's the Drosophila for cognitive science, it really tells you that cognitive science is way off on the wrong track. And it starts from the very beginning. And I think it's because of a kind of lingering behaviorism, which showed up as the idea that intelligence is whatever satisfies a certain operational criterion. And if the operational criterion is playing a decent game against a grandmaster, we study that. But the natural sciences have nothing like that. In the natural sciences, there are no operational criteria. Like nobody sets up an operational criterion for something being a liquid, you know, like it feels wet or something like that. I mean, you can set up any operational criterion you like. There are times it doesn't. They don't mean anything. You're interested in looking at, you know, trying to discover those phenomena that lead you to understanding. Now, it's interesting that when you go back to the 17th and 18th century, people, the simulation that was done then was scientific. So when Beaucanson constructed a duck that was digesting, he wasn't trying to fool people into thinking it was a duck. He was trying to learn something about digestion. In fact, he purposely made it transparent for that reason. That's quite different than modern cognitive science and the modern concept of simulation, which is basically an effort to fool people, see if a machine can fool people.
So in a certain way, it's going back.
I think it's going back way before that. I mean, it's going back to some primitive period that the Cartesian revolution escaped. Because already in the 17th and 18th century, the concept of simulation was understood the way it's understood in the modern sciences. The guys who were constructing these automata were not trying to fool people into thinking it was a person or a duck or something. They were trying to say, what can I learn about a duck from this automaton? That's the way people construct the model of, you know, the heavens or something. It's not the way people do cognitive science. I think this is a regression to the pre-scientific era. And as for reasons, I think it's a link. I don't think, I said that there was a move away from behaviorism, but I don't really believe it. There was an effort to move away from behaviorism, but it fell right back into it in an even worse sense than behaviorism, namely the attempt to satisfy operational criteria. That's the role that the Turing test plays in contemporary cognitive science. I'll come back to this in more detail, but that's what I think.
You briefly mentioned indeterminism in physics, and you also talked mentioned Priestley in relation to the brain secreting something. You mentioned Priestley. You also mentioned. You also. Now you hear me. Okay. You also mentioned Priestley in relation to the brain somehow secreting emotion. So I wanted to ask whether you envisage perhaps some kind of theory accommodating indeterminism for free will, or sense of free will as being secreted in a secreted illusion, or perhaps being analogous to the moon illusion, or free will being beyond our comprehension. In relation to what
I don't know. I have no theory about it. My only theory about it is it's probably a mystery. I mean, phenomenally, it looks like a mystery. The phenomenon of confronting free will looks to me like the way a rat would probably feel if it was facing a right, left maze. Something's going on out there, but it can't figure out what it is, you know. The phenomena look so obvious, it's hard to deny them. I don't think it's got anything to do with indeterminacy. I mean, well, like take, say, Roger Penrose, you know, sort of leading quantum physicist. He argues that quantum physics is wrong, hasn't really, is a tentative, temporary theory, hasn't quite reached the truth. And when it reaches the truth, it'll explain the mind. Well, I don't know. I'm not enough of a scientist to judge what he's saying, but I don't see any reason to believe that. It doesn't seem to be getting us anywhere near the question. Quantum indeterminacy seems to have totally different properties. It's no more relevant than classical determinacy. As for Priestley, he was just making a common sense, I think he was making a common sense observation. He was saying, look, since there's no matter around anymore, because Newton got rid of it, things like power of attraction and repulsion, which we don't understand in his day, and electricity and magnetism, which we don't understand, and human thought, which we don't understand, are just properties of organized matter. And we've got to try to understand them in parallel ways. As to how to understand them, it's the kind of thing that you never know until you've done it. It doesn't make much sense speculating about how it'll work out. The only thing that's worth speculating about, I think, is whether some of these questions are in the mystery space for humans, which they might be. And about that, we could conceivably learn something. They do have that feel. And in fact, I think Colin McGinn is basically correct in saying that most philosophical problems have that feel. Problem of consciousness, for example, is one, you can't deny. I mean, there are people who deny that people are conscious, or who claim that thermostats are conscious. That just seems ridiculous. It just seems an obvious truth. But nobody has the foggiest idea about how organized matter can have this property. There are lots of bad books about the subject which claim to have solved it. But if you look at them, they haven't done anything. They've just restated the problem.
I was just wondering if you can comment on, it sounds to me that the problem and mystery, whether we can learn something that might be in the realm of mystery, it seems to be kind of a new taxonomy of knowledge that we're looking for. And if you think that if you can comment on this, if you think there is some discourse that's privileged and some discourse that's marginalized in this kind of looking at cognition as it never has been looked at before.
When you're using those terms in a kind of a Foucault-like sense.
Yes, yeah. I was thinking of the order of things.
Yeah. I can't really comment on that stuff because I don't understand a word of it, to tell you the truth.
Classification system.
Yeah.
Do you think we're looking for a new classification of knowledge? Mm-hmm. And do you think that there is, in this classification of knowledge, if some discourse has more difficulty being elicited and shown?
Well, let me start with a personal confession of inadequacy. When I read anything that starts with post-structuralism, postmodernism, post-anything else, my eyes glaze over. I don't understand it, when I say I don't understand it, I mean, not that I don't get some kind of a feeling from it, I sort of get a kind of a feel of what Foucault's talking about, and often not even that, but I have no cognitive understanding of it. Furthermore, so therefore I'm just evading the question for that reason. And just to continue with personal inadequacy, it's lack of understanding of a very special kind. I mean, there's lots of things I don't understand. Like, I take the last issue of Physical Review, let's say, and I open it. I'm not going to understand one word in any article there. However, that's different. It's different in two respects. One respect is I know I can go over to my friend in the physics department and say, look, can you tell me what this is about at my level of, foolishness and lack of knowledge? And they can do it. A good physicist can tell you, it's sort of about this, and skip this step, and here's the problem, and you can get to understand it. So, like, say, take Roger Penrose. When he writes about quantum physics, he's skipping all kind of steps. He's not telling you what a tensor is, and all sorts of things. You can kind of understand it. Now, in the case of post-X, nobody can explain it to me. I mean, when somebody explains it to me, I'm just as confused as before. The other thing is that in the case of other hard things, like, say, contemporary set theory or quantum theory or something, I know there's a path that I can follow to get to understand it. And in some cases where I'm particularly interested, like, say, foundations of mathematics, I've done it. I'm not really good at it, but I can sort of follow it. And in this case, I wouldn't even know how to start. I look at pages, and it's just, I can look at it forever, and I never make any progress. And nobody can help me. So it's a different kind of lack of understanding. And therefore, I'm just sort of off in outer space as far as this stuff is concerned. I don't, and hence that's why I'm evading the question. I mean, not only do I not comprehend it, I don't know how to go about comprehending it.
Well,
Some people seem to, but maybe there's a genetic difference or something.
if I can ask in a different way.
Maybe it's like
perhaps.
tone, could be kind of like being tone deaf. You know, if you're tone deaf, you just can't hear. I can't hear this stuff.
No, if I can just ask in a different way, do you feel that cognitive, the study of cognition, as you've been describing it, is another paradigm shift in the way we look at knowledge?
Well, I mentioned before that Tom Kuhn is an old friend of mine, and one thing we've disagreed about over the years is about paradigm shifts. I mean, in my opinion, there's about two of them in all of intellectual history. I mean, there was, the Galilean-Newtonian revolution. There was quantum theory, and I don't know, maybe, I don't even think evolutionary theory counts. It's too simple. No. Maybe there are others, but if so, I don't see them. I mean, people talk about paradigm shifts all the time. I remember not long ago reading an article about this by a linguist. Guy was in Berlin, I forget. He was writing kind of a history of modern linguistics, and there was a paradigm shift about every 3 weeks. But I don't see any. I mean, the shifts are so small, that it's really kind of reconstructing old ideas and understanding them a little better, maybe with new technical understanding or something or other. So it seems to me the terms like paradigm shift are kind of too inflated for the sort of thing that most of us do. It's all what Kuhn would call normal science. He doesn't agree with it, I should say. And you got to take it seriously. He invented the story, but it's a question of where what orders of magnitude seem to you to be important, and people just have different judgments about this. Well, let me mention Penrose again. This is interesting. He divides theories into 3 types, what he calls superb, useful, and tentative. And his level is so inflated that thermodynamics doesn't make it beyond useful, and contemporary particle theory doesn't even make it to useful. Okay, well, if those are your standards, then we're somewhere else, in some other world. But all the talk about, the fact of the matter is, there have been only, I think, a few real changes in the way people have looked at things, and those really are paradigm shifts. And they're hard, they're difficult. They're difficult to comprehend. They require revising of the way you think about everything. It just doesn't seem to happen in other fields. The changes are small. We don't understand enough. If there's any improvement this time. Thank you. Well, I suggested this morning that in a post-Newtonian world, we are left with no notion of matter or body or physical, hence no notion of physicalism, no notion of physicalist reductionism, no notion of eliminative materialism in the sense of many cognitive scientists. Of course, no notion of metaphysical dualism. These notions simply seem to have no definition, no specific, they don't have any meaning, since the notion physical has disappeared. And again, the notion physical disappeared because Newton demonstrated that physical has ghostly qualities, if you like, all the way down to the simplest phenomenon. In my opinion, that either this is true or it's not true. If it's not true, I'd like to see a reason why. If it is true, I think it is, it's taken much less seriously than it should be. Because if it is true, it's extremely hard to translate an enormous amount of discussion in philosophy of mind in a way which makes it into something that makes any sense. It just doesn't seem to mean anything, because there doesn't seem to be any topic. There would be a topic only if the notion physical were in some manner characterized, and that no one's tried to do. And they haven't tried to do it mainly because it can't be done. The physical is just whatever we come to understand, more or less. That's the physical. There is no other, there isn't, or else what is actually there, if you want to take a realist position. It's whatever's there. And there's no question of reducing anything to that. Everything's just part of that. Well, I'll, with metaphysical dualism now unstatable, and recall that metaphysical dualism could be, and I think in the Cartesian version was, a naturalistic position, something that comes out of the inquiry in the scientific style. With metaphysical dualism now unstable, is there any alternative to naturalism? Is there any kind of dualism that one can put forth? And in fact, there is only one kind. It's kind of a methodological or epistemological dualism that says we're not allowed to understand, to study human beings in the way in which we study everything else. Or at least we're not allowed to study, keeping to the same metaphor, human beings above the neck, the mental, in the manner in which we study anything else. Now, as distinct from metaphysical dualism, that appears to be a totally irrational position. It doesn't have any saving graces. Unless somebody gives a reason for it, it seems that it should just be dismissed. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, I think it's a very pervasive position, and I'll try to illustrate in the next day or so how pervasive it is. In my own opinion, it's not only pervasive, it's all-inclusive. That is just about everything in the field, referring now to the considered parts of the field, not the actual research, but the thinking about them. Falls under irrational methodological or epistemological dualism in this sense. Well, I'll give some examples in a moment, but first let me just, for concreteness more or less, spell out what I think a naturalistic program would lead to. I could use any area, but there's only one area of the mental where there's real progress, namely language. And let me sketch out what it would lead to, I think, in the case of language. I'm not going to try to give any evidence or any reasons, I'll come back to that later, but just to give an indication of what I think one finds. Well, it seems to me that what, in the case of language, what one finds is that what's involved in human language is the human brain, not the foot. You cut off a person's foot, they have no trouble speaking, but if you cut out the brain, they have trouble speaking. So to start with, it seems to be localized to the brain. Furthermore, it seems to be in certain parts of the brain. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean an area that you can cut out, but although even that's partially true. But certain subsystems of the brain seem to be specifically dedicated to language. So let's just give them a name and call them the language faculty. So that's whatever subsystem of the brain is dedicated to the storing and the use of language. When we look more closely at the language faculty, we find two kinds of systems. There's one which we call cognitive system, and there's another actual class which we can call performance systems. I'll come back to spelling out more later. The cognitive system, the world doesn't have to be like this. It's true, it's an empirical statement about human language, about the architecture of the brain. The cognitive system is a computational representational system which stores information. It stores, in fact, the infinite information we all have about the properties of the expressions of our language, about their sound properties, their meaning properties, their structural properties, and so on. That is to say that the cognitive system is obviously a finite object, brain. So it's some kind of finite object that stores an infinite amount of information. And that notion was a big problem throughout much of modern history when people were thinking about this topic. It was recognized long ago that we have unbounded knowledge, but that we have finite minds, as they would have been called. And that was an insoluble problem until the 20th century, when it finally became very clearly understood what that means. What that means is there's a certain kind of property of the brain, namely the property of being what's called a generative procedure, or recursive procedure, which characterizes an infinite amount of information in a finite way. Now, that happens to be a particularly well understood property by now. So saying that the brain has this property is not a particularly, it could be false, but it's not. There's nothing mysterious about it. Surely the brain has property. And this particular property, the property of being a generative procedure, is a property which is particularly well understood. In fact, the whole field of mathematics about it that has made it very well understood. With that technical insight, the insight into some technical kind of underplays it with the insight into what it means for a finite procedure to capture infinite amounts of information. With that formal insight, it becomes possible to address the traditional concerns about how you could have infinite unbounded knowledge with only a finite brain. Address them. And in many ways, modern linguistics comes out of that confluence, the confluence of a formal insight and a traditional problem. Now, unfortunately, it didn't work like this. In a rational world, it would have worked. The reason it didn't work like this is that the traditional concerns had all been forgotten by the time modern linguistics came along, and we were in a behaviorist world, an externalist behaviorist world where these traditional concerns had disappeared. So you had to reinvent the traditional concerns as well because of the remarkable parochialism of the professional disciplines. And that includes all of them, linguistics, philosophy, and psychology, none of which were aware of the traditional concerns. I should say that these traditional concerns were not very far back. So, for example, as recently as, say, the 1920s, this is mostly work in the 1950s, as recently as the 1920s, Otto Jespersen, well known, a Danish linguist, coming now at the tail end of a several century-old tradition, wrote that the goal of linguistics, the goal of the study of language, is to characterize what he called the notion of structure that people have in their minds that guides them to form and understand arbitrary expressions, including what he called free expressions, meaning ones that they'd never heard before and that had never been produced before, and so on. Well, that's the right idea, and it goes back a couple hundred years. But when I was a student back in the 1940s, nobody knew Greek Jespersen. In fact, I just learned about him out of curiosity, picking up books in the library. And everything else in the history had disappeared as well. In fact, we were talking a little bit this morning about the schizophrenia of scientists around the turn of the century. The schizophrenia of serious scholars around this period, 1940s, is quite remarkable when you look back in retrospect. A very striking example of it. There are kind of lessons in this for the future, which is why I'm going off into anecdotes. But the leading American linguist in that period, say the 1930s, was Leonard Bloomfield, who happened to be both a Sanskrit scholar, a scholar of Indic and Germanic studies. Really knew Indo-European linguistics and Sanskrit and so on and so forth. So that was one half of his brain. The other half of his brain, he was trying to be a hard-headed scientist, reading stuff from the Vienna Circle on logical positivism and contributing to meetings in the Vienna Circle and laying the foundations for modern hard-headed structuralism. He was a very committed behaviorist and, what was considered at the time a tough-minded scientist. And actually, if you look back at his work, he was doing two kinds of work, which he kept totally separate. How he managed it internally, I have no idea. But in the Germanic, Indic, Sanskrit side of his brain, he was writing generative grammars. He wrote a grammar of, he was working with American Indian languages, but he wrote a detailed grammar of an American, an Algonquin language, Menominee, in the 1930s, which is a generative grammar in more or less the modern sense, with rules and rule ordering and so on. It didn't go into syntax because no one knew how to bridge that gap to infinite information with finite rules. But it did deal with phonology, morphology, the parts of language that people knew how to finite characterize. And it dealt with by ordered rules and rules of considerable depth and all sorts of things that are by now familiar. On the other half of his brain, where he was being a hard-headed scientist, the reason he did it is because he knew traditional Indian linguistics from 2,500 years earlier, where that's exactly the way it was done. So if you read Panini, let's say, 5 centuries BC, it's a generative grammar in the modern sense. That's what he knew. That's what he did when he was doing serious linguistics. On the other hand, as a theoretician and a hard-headed scientist, he was writing derisive critiques of people who talk about ordered rules and all these crazy mentalists, when everybody knows that all there is behavior and the structure of discourse and, all this kind of hard-headed type stuff. I got to, and these are in the same years. In fact, it's interesting that his Menominee Morphonemics he published in a place which was quite remote in those days, in the Czech linguistics journal, the Travaux for Czechoslovakia, something which nobody in the United States would ever read. Actually, I was a student about 10 years later, and my professors were students and associates of Bloomfield's. One of them, in particular, had the same mixture of interests. He was an Indo-Germanic scholar who knew Sanskrit and also a modern linguist. And at that time, I also did a generative grammar as an undergraduate thesis. But nobody ever pointed out to me that Bloomfield had done it 10 years ago. Now, they had to have known it. I never asked anybody. It never occurred to me to ask them. And I only found out about this years later when all this stuff was rediscovered. But the point is, it was so deeply hidden that even people who had to be aware of it never suggested to an undergraduate that he should look at it, because it was considered so outrageous. Why did Bloomfield do it? Because in the sensible half of his brain, he knew how else could you do it. It's the only sensible way to do anything. But what was sensible was totally repressed. It took a while. This is maybe much more extreme case than the case of molecules that we talked about earlier. But it's a warning. It's a warning about excessive parochialism and taking seriously things that ought to be questioned, which in an area like this means almost anything. Coming back to this picture, we have a cognitive system, which is some kind of generative procedure, recursive procedure, that stores an infinite amount of information, in particular information about sound-meaning relations. And as to its nature, we have a huge amount of data from a lot of different languages, fairly reliable data, and some theories which are not inconsiderable, some theories which have gone somewhere towards explaining a fair amount of that evidence. So, though there's a lot not known about the cognitive system of the language faculty, there's been substantial progress in understanding it, and one sort of knows how to proceed. And there's plenty to do. It's a normal science problem in that sense. With regard to the performance systems, much less is known. It's generally assumed that the performance systems are fixed and invariant, that they don't change through childhood, let's say. You don't learn them. It's usually assumed that you don't learn a parsing theory, for example. You just have it. Okay? And the same for every other performance system. The reason for that assumption is not that anybody knows anything about it. In fact, it's precisely because nobody knows anything about it. Since you don't know anything about it, you might as well make the simplest assumption, which is that it's invariant. And until you have some other evidence, just go on from there. So the usually tacit assumption that performance systems are fixed and unlearned is basically due to ignorance. Could be true, could not be true, but until more is learned about them, it'll be hard to answer. With regard to the cognitive system, which is much better understood, it's known that it is not fixed, at least not entirely fixed. So Catalan is English, as I find out if I walk outside. Although that could very well be a misleading impression. From the point of view of a rational Martian scientist looking at this universe, he probably would say Catalan just is English, with some trivial changes, that aren't worth looking at. And that seems to be a sort of, in advance, it's reasonable to suppose that that's what will ultimately be discovered. The reason why it's reasonable to suppose that's what ultimately will be discovered is that if that isn't true, it's extremely hard to explain the fact that anybody knows Catalan or that anybody knows English. That is, if you compare what is known with the database for it, the qualitative difference, the gap is so extraordinary that short of miracles, you can only conclude that it all came from the inside. But if it all came from the inside, and it's obvious we're not genetically designed to speak English or Catalan, then it's just got to be the same language with minor variations. And in fact, one of the intellectual challenges of the field is to demonstrate what you sort of know in advance has to be true, that there really is only one language, and that the differences between them must be very peripheral and must be located in those parts of the system that are very for which there is direct data. So about phonetics, there's a fair amount of data. You hear it. So that vary a little bit. But most of the computational part of the system you have no evidence about, and therefore it almost has to be unique. Current theories, which I'll hope to be able to get to later, do in fact propose that there really is only one computational system for language, and that the differences are located completely outside the computational system. That's far from having been proven, but it's what ought to be true. And you can now kind of postulate it without absurdity. Not proving it, but postulate it without absurdity, and that you know enough so you can see how it could be true. And assuming that it's true helps explain a lot of things. Well, that's getting ahead of the game. In any event, the cognitive system does undergo some changes, but probably limited changes. It starts in some kind of initial state, and it goes through a series of states, and it ultimately stabilizes. Apparently there's what's called a critical period for this. It's not certain, but there seems to be a critical period. There's mounting evidence, meaning that it has to take place during some period of physical development, probably pre-puberty. It seems that if it takes changes that take place later seem much more peripheral to the system. But the major fixing of the system seems to be extremely early. In fact, the better the experimental techniques are, the earlier it gets. By now, some of the results are pretty astonishing. So, for example, there's some evidence recently that 4-day-old infants can distinguish the native language of their mother from another language when spoken by another person. So, for example, that's a 4-day-old, happened to be done in France, 4-day-old French infant listening to a bilingual woman, not his mother, say, who speaks, a true bilingual who speaks French and Russian. The 4-day-old will respond differently to that woman speaking French and that woman speaking Russian. So that means within 4 days, or even even before birth, something got fixed. Some differences got fixed. Things like the basic intonational structure of languages seems to be at least in part fixed before 6 months of age, meaning before the kid has said one sound. The same seems to be true of things like finding the regions within which certain phonological units appear, like the regions, say, a vowel might differ somewhat from Polish to Chinese or something. And those things also seem to be fixed pretty well by 6 months, say. And if we get better experimental techniques to make it down earlier, one of the interesting and kind of exciting things about working developmental psychology in the last couple of years is that with the improvement of experimental technique, you just keep pushing down the stage of innate knowledge earlier and earlier. By now, it's in most areas way before any overt behavior. So, for example, to go up a little bit, it's by now well established that let's say 20-month-old children or 2-year-old children, say 20 months, their behavior is maybe what are called 2-word sentences, like, something that means give me that or something which comes out as 2 words, that those children are able to not only fully comprehend 7 or 8-word sentences, but even figure out the meanings of words from the structural properties of 7 or 8-word sentences that they're given, all way in advance of any performance. Well, again, this shouldn't surprise anyone who takes a naturalistic point of view to humans. After all, we assume that automatically for every other aspect of development. I mean, nobody assumes that other aspects of development are taught, and there's no reason why this should be. But for the study of cognitive processes, it's an important discovery because it tends to overcome that irrational dualism that I've been talking about. Well, I'll come back to that. In any event, the cognitive system does change to a certain degree. It doesn't seem to change very much. It gets fixed at some stage, apparently pre-puberty and maybe well earlier than that, and within pretty narrow limits. The attained state, in fact, all the states, is a generative procedure of the kind that I mentioned, a computational representational system. A generative procedure generates something, forms things. And in this case, the generative procedure, this is what's sometimes called a grammar, but that's probably a bad term, so I'll keep away from it. The generative procedure generates linguistic expressions, a certain set of objects, call them linguistic expressions. Each one of these guys is itself a collection of properties. So one of them is, say the word, not some sentence or other. That sentence or other is some collection of properties, namely a collection of phonetic and what are called semantic, and others just the structural. Got too many braces here. These two go together. So each linguistic expression is a collection of a variety of properties. The linguistic expression, say, table in my language, has certain sounds and certain instructions as to how to use it to refer and so on. So you refer to this, but not the house, and so on. Those are the properties of the word table, what's called the word table. And the generative procedure assigns those sets of properties for every expression. What's generated, in other words, is a set of expressions, what are called technically structural descriptions. We can pull out some piece of these things. So, for example, if we look only, say, at this part, if we look only at this part of the linguistic expression, we have something which we could give a name to. We could call it a signal, let's say. And similarly, we could just pull out these parts, and then we would have something that we might call a concept or something like that. But the linguistic expression itself is just a collection of all of these things. Okay. The signal could be phonetic, but that's a little misleading because we now know that it could be other things. So it could be sign, for example. Sign seems to be learned pretty much the same way spoken language is, and surprisingly, it even seems to be localized in the same parts of the brain, which is quite surprising because the modality is completely different. it's coming in through a visual rather than an auditory modality. But it seems to be ending up being processed in the same part of the brain, actually on the left side, the side that's not used for visual processing, which is a particularly remarkable fact in the case of sign language. And there's a lot of interesting discoveries about that, which tell you a lot about the structure of the language, the structure of the language faculty of the brain, and how its parts are parceled out for different kinds of activities. In any event, the cognitive part seems to be sort of modality independent. It doesn't seem to matter whether the input to it, the signal that's coming in, is coming through the eye or through the ear, as long as it's of the right type. And that means that the notion's phonetic part of the linguistic expression has to be understood somewhat more abstractly as whatever part gives instructions to the articulate, the production and perceptive system. Okay, the normal case is articulatory, but it's now known that it's not the only case. How many others there are, no knows. You don't do experiments on these things. You look at what's around. That Marshman I was talking about might do experiments and could learn a lot, but for ethical reasons we do. The linguistic expression then is a collection of those things. It has manifestations. Signals are manifestations. In a much more general sense, you could say speech acts, like the act of referring to something or asking about something or whatever. Speech acts are also manifestations of linguistic expressions, where if you think of a linguistic expression as a set of instructions to performance systems, if you look just at the instructions, say, for the articulatory system, you'll end up with what the signal will be. If you look at a broader set of instructions to other performance systems, you will get an act, an act that a person performs, like the act of referring to this object, the word table, which is something I could do. That act is another manifestation of the linguistic expression, where the instructions have been used by other performance systems. That's the basic picture. Now, here we have to begin being a bit careful. It's common in ordinary discourse, or sort of unreflective talk about language, to say things like, this word has changed its meaning in the last 100 years, or it's changed its sound in the last 100 years. It used to be pronounced this way, now it's pronounced that way, and it used to mean this, and now it means that. Strictly speaking, that's meaning. The word is just a collection of its properties, and if the properties change, it's a different word. I mean, it's as if you sort of pick some mountain, say Mount Tanagu, that's around here somewhere, and you said, is it the same mountain after an avalanche? Well, that's a matter of decision, not fact. Same mountain, if you want to call it the same mountain. Is it the same mountain after one grain of dust is moved? Well, again, that's a matter of decision. There's no answer to that question. It's a question of if you want it within a certain range of human interest, yes. Within another range of interest, no. Similarly, if I say that, but there's no absolute answer to the question, that means that there's no real meaning. There's no absolute meaning to the notion. The word changed sound or the word changed meaning. There isn't much confusion about this in connection with words changing sound, but the question of words changing meaning is a big topic. An awful lot of modern philosophy is concerned with how words get their meanings fixed. That's no more significant than the question of how words get their sound fixed, which is not considered a big problem, because we're less confused about sound than we are about meaning for some reason. But it's basically the same question. The only question is how the collection of features gets combined, and that's neutral between sound and meaning. And to say that the words change meaning, or this way of fixing their meaning or something, is really not to ask a very serious question. Similarly, when you ask whether a word means the same thing for me as it does for you, or whether it sounds the same for me as it sounds to you, that doesn't strictly speaking mean anything, because it's not the same word for you and for me. It's like asking, do you look like me? Do we look like? Well, there's no absolute answer to that. Relative to a certain set of interests, you might say that Luigi and I look alike, as compared with maybe somebody from Africa or something. Relative to another set of interests, we don't look alike. But there's no true answer to that question. You take two people and you say they look alike. There's no true answer. It's an answer that's relative to all kinds of human interests and concerns. And the same is the case when you ask whether two people have the same word or the same expression or speak the same language or whatever. It's all a question of whether it's like asking, do they look alike? There's nothing very profound about this, but it's worth keeping in mind because I think it's constantly forgotten. Again, I'll come back to cases where it's forgotten. A lot of for those of you who know the philosophical literature, a lot of the contemporary theory of reference, which is called externalist theory of reference, idea being that the reference of words is determined by things in the world and communities, crucially. That's the ruling theory of reference. I think an awful lot of that is based on this confusion and disappears as soon as this confusion is eliminated. I'll come back to that, but that's the reason I'm bringing it up now. Before bringing it up, let me just, before going to the applications, let me just repeat what should be obvious, that a word or a phrase or a sentence or a text or whatever is a collection of properties. It's a collection of properties, some of which are instructions to the articulatory system, some of them are instructions to the referring system, some are instructions to some other thing. That collection of properties is the linguistic expression. There's no substantive meaning to the question whether one person has the same linguistic expression as another. It's like the question, do they have the same shape? Yes or no, depending on what you happen to be interested in. Suppose that the cognitive system, as mentioned, does pass through a sequence of states and hits a sort of stable state. We'll assume that the performance systems don't, though mainly out of ignorance. Suppose the cognitive system reaches the state, let's call it L. That's the state that the cognitive system reaches, and that's where it sort of stabilizes some usually early stage of life, maybe necessarily early stage of life, and after that it undergoes only peripheral changes, like maybe learning new vocabulary items, which we forget about. In that case, if the cognitive system has stabilized in the state L, we'll say that, let's say it's Peter's cognitive system. So we have somebody over here named Peter. We'll say if Peter's cognitive system stabilizes in the state L, we'll say that Peter knows or speaks or has the language L. That's what it means to say that somebody speaks a language or knows a language or has language, to put it in more neutral terminology. So to say that I have some special variety of that crazy mass of things that are called English is to say that my cognitive state stabilized in that particular system when I was, 10 years old or something. I'll come back to sharpening that up for a moment. But as a first approximation, that's what it means to say that somebody has a language. The language, then, is just the state that the cognitive system reaches. That's all it is. Now, to avoid pointless terminological controversy as to whether this is really language or not, notice in advance, we know before we can start that the terms common discourse are not going to survive into theoretical discussion. I mean, everybody knows that in the case of, say, the natural sciences. Like, nobody cares whether the word energy, liquid, or momentum, say, as it's used in physics, has the same meaning as the same word in natural language. And of course, it never does. It would be a miracle if a word of natural language could survive the transition into the natural sciences. It would be an astonishing miracle. No reason why that should happen. The words of natural language develop the way they develop, are part of it. In fact, what Newton showed is, contrary to everyone's expectations, including his, he had a ghost all the way down. That is, even ordinary matter in the most elementary dynamics had ghostly properties. It wasn't just the mind. Everything is ghostly. So Newton showed that contact mechanics amazingly just didn't work. It was true that you could influence things at a distance. Now Newton, scientists of the day, including Newton incidentally, thought that this was absurd. Newton himself called universal gravitation an occult property. He said anyone with any brains at all can see that it's inconceivable that something can influence something that it's not in direct contact with. Yet we seem to have to assume that. Well, now, from his point of view, I mean, some major scientists of the day, people like, say, Huygens and others, just threw it out for this reason because it was idiotic. Newton was himself torn by it, you know. He realized it's just got to be right because it was such a spectacular breakthrough. On the other hand, it made absolutely no sense because it was inconsistent with mechanical philosophy. And what in fact happened is he didn't get rid of the ghost in the machine, but he just showed that all properties of matter are ghostly. It's all a ghost. It's all unintelligible, all the way down to terrestrial motion and planetary motion, which is a big problem and remains a big problem. And it led to a totally new way of looking at science. This has been pointed out repeatedly. Bernard Cohen, who's maybe the major Newton scholar, points out, I'll just quote his version of it. He said by entering into this paradoxical world, he said Newton set forth a new view of science in which the goal is to find the best theoretical explanation, irrespective of any intuitive notion we may have of ultimate explanation. The point is there is a ghost in the machine, and that's just the way the machines are. They're ghostly. You can't do anything about it. The mechanical philosophy appears to be wrong. Although it's self-evidently true, it just seems to be wrong. From this point on, we must find his quote. We must be satisfied with universal gravitation. Let's call it UG for short. We'll come back to that. We must be satisfied with UG and that it exists, even if we cannot explain it in terms of the self-evident mechanical philosophy. That's just where we are. Science means accepting UG if you have evidence for it, and it provides you with an intelligible scientific theory, even if there's no way of accounting for it in terms of what's self-evident, namely the mechanical philosophy, which you just have to admit is wrong, even though it's self-evidently true. From this point on, people's intuitions about what must be true become irrelevant. It's become irrelevant. So if the way to deal with universal gravitation is through curved space-time, okay. If the way to deal with the universe is through weird quantum mechanical effects, too bad for intuition. If the world really is made up of infinite one-dimensional strings in 10-dimensional space, okay, got to stuck with that. Time has a beginning, fine, time has a beginning. Whatever lunatic idea people will come up with tomorrow has to be evaluated in its own merits. Does it yield insight and understanding? Does it help us come to terms with the nature of the world? If it does, it satisfies conditions for rational inquiry, irrespective of our intuitions. The Newtonian revolution, in fact, even earlier, the Galilean revolution, I think that's its essential content. It's kind of general content. It's sort of that. From then on, you're off on a totally new path. That's why it's really the one real scientific revolution in human history. It just set inquiry off on an entirely new path, and that's where we are. We have no other criteria. Common sense criteria are irrelevant. Now, we can't get out of our skin. I mean, you go out in the evening and you see the sun set, and no matter what you know, you still see the sun set. And when you see the moon near the horizon, it's just bigger than when you see it up there. You can't not see the moon illusion. So we see the world in terms of the way we are. Can't help it. Just like we intuitively feel that the mechanical philosophy must be true. because how could it not be? But we have come to recognize that the way we see the world is just another fact to be explained about the world. So if we see the sun set and we see the moon illusion and we believe in the mechanical philosophy, no matter how much we try not to, that's just a fact about the world. In fact, it's a fact about a very special part of the world, namely the human mind brain and the way in which it acts and conceptualizes and constructs and so on, and we'd like to come to understand that. And in order to do it, we have to make a kind of an intellectual wrench. We have to take ourselves out of our skins and look back at ourselves kind of reflexively as part of the world. And that's hard, but, that's what it means to take to study human beings naturalistically. So that's the move one has to make, to study human beings naturalistically. And then the way we look at things in common sense no longer provides a criterion for intelligible explanation, but rather it's just a phenomenon to be explained. Now, there's a real problem here, which you can see right off. Whatever the working notion of intelligible explanation is again something that's inside our skins, and we're stuck with that. That's something like a real paradox. We can only, whatever our capacities to carry out rational inquiry may be, say some corner of our brain, which let's just call it science-forming faculty to dignify ignorance with a title, but there's some part of our brain that enables us to carry out rational inquiry, and it uses its own resources and its own criteria, which may be as misleading as moon illusion. Maybe it's always systematically leading us away from the nature of the world. If we're creatures of the world, that would not be in the least surprising. But there we can't do anything about it, because we're stuck with those. That's as deep as you can go. You can't go beyond those. So if we're systematically misled about the world because of the way our science-forming faculty happens to be constructed, that we can't do much about. But we can overcome the moon illusion. It's hard, but we can overcome it. We can't stop seeing it. We can't stop seeing the sun setting. You can't stop believing in the mechanical philosophy. Newton's intuitions are, at least my intuitions, but that part you can throw out. The part that's guiding our search for intelligible theory, we can't throw out. There's no way to get out of that. And there you are approaching something which is kind of like classical paradox, maybe. But we have to recognize from the naturalistic point of view that we are just a particular organism trying to understand the world, and we've got to do it our way, because there is no other possibility. Well, so anyway, getting past through metaphysical dualism, we've now abandoned metaphysical dualism, but abandoned it in a very special way. It's not that there's a ghost in the machine, it's that the machine has ghostly properties all the way. Maybe it has even more ghostly properties above the neck. If so, okay, but that's just another fact. However, it's already unintelligible to common sense down to elementary dynamics. That's Newton's basic discovery. That's why contemporary discussion ridiculing the ghost in the machine is completely off track, in my opinion. It's just missing the point of what happened. There was no criticism made of the Cartesian theory of mind. You could argue that's because it wasn't substantive enough, maybe. But in any event, it survived all of this intact, such as it was. What did not survive is the theory of the machine. Contact mechanics was thrown out. And the common sense of the next scientific generation is that the mechanical philosophy is wrong. Actually, it took a long time for this to settle in. For a couple hundred years in physics, people were trying to find mechanical explanations. And it really wasn't until probably the 20th century that was given up. You get as late as people like Poincaré. He was arguing that the molecular theory of gases we adopt only because as a computing mechanism. And the only reason we adopt it is because we're familiar with the game of billiards. So it's kind of convenient computing mechanism. And efforts to try to explain things in terms of, ether and stuff like that are an attempt to carry out mechanical philosophy. And it was a long time before, it was really this century before Newton's insight was basically incorporated into the sciences. And it harder maybe even to do it in the emerging sciences. But anyhow, I think in retrospect, that's the way we have to look at it. Well, if this is correct, then so I'm being kind of anachronistic when I say that the 17th century exorcised mechanical philosophy. It did in principle, it didn't get to it in fact. It left a big residue of unhappiness and confusion that took centuries to sort out. But looking back, it seems fair to say, abstractly speaking, that Newton exorcised the machine. He got rid of the mechanical philosophy. Footnote, it's an anachronism to say it that way, but I think an accurate historical reconstruction. And I'll continue with historical reconstruction. Well, one consequence of eliminating the machine is that we've gotten rid of any notion of body or physical or material. There no longer is any notion of the material world. Remember, Descartes could be a dualist because he had a notion of body. Body is not a very clear notion, but at least a general notion. Body is defined by the mechanical philosophy, by contact mechanics. That's body. Okay. Now, Newton showed that's not the way body works. So therefore, we have no conception of body. In fact, it's just a world, whatever it is. If the world has mental properties, it's part of the world. But there is no notion of body. Unless somebody comes up with a new notion, and nobody's ever done that, unless somebody comes up with a new notion of the physical, talk about physicalism or materialism or eliminative materialism or the mind-body problem and so on, just seems to be meaningless. Now, if this is correct, something very curious has happened because people are talking about it all the time. There's all kind of stuff right up to the present about the mind-body problem. And there are theories in the cognitive sciences, say the church ones, called eliminative materialism, which says we shouldn't study the mind, we should just study the material world. And there's a lot of questions about physicalist reductionism. Can we reduce things to physical terms? In fact, this is universal philosophy in these areas. But I don't understand it. Maybe nobody can explain it. It seems that once we have lost the notion of physical, none of this discussion is even meaningful. It doesn't mean anything. You can't have a problem of reducing things to the material if there's no notion of material. And there is no notion of material. What is it? I mean, somebody could say, well, it's what they teach over in the physics department. But the people in the physics department will tell you that's not true, because they expect 2 years from now to be teaching something else, at least if the subject's still alive. So that can't be true. And there is no other notion. All we have is the world with whatever properties it has. There's no notion of material world or physical world. Hence, all of the problems of reduction have disappeared. The problems of elimination of study of the mind in favor of neurophysiology or something don't mean anything. They're just purely irrational statements saying instead of studying this part of the world, let's study that part of the world, if you want to. But it doesn't make any more sense than saying since solids are hard to study, let's study liquids. Maybe, okay, but it's of no more interest than that. Unless somebody can come along with a theory, with the concept of the material to replace the Cartesian concept, which has been thrown out the window. And as far as I know, nobody has even addressed that problem, let alone offered an answer to it. And if so, again, let me try to put it in the strongest terms. Virtually all the discussion in the field is not just wrong, but meaningless, literally without meaning. It's talking about a problem that's unstatable. That's the strongest version of the position I'm trying to take. So let me put it in the most outrageous form possible. The whole field is not wrong, but meaningless. Talking about something that it can't characterize, namely something that presupposes a notion of physical, which has been abandoned since the 17th century. That's the strongest version of this particular thesis. Well, with metaphysical dualism now unstable, because we don't have any body anymore, notions like eliminative materialism and so on lose sense, and the kind of natural conclusion to draw from Newton's demolition of the theory of matter, and that's what it was, is to, the natural conclusion is to say that human thought and action, say creative aspects of language use, are just properties of organized matter. That's all there is. There's nothing else. So they're just properties of organized matter. And in fact, that conclusion was drawn sporadically, but not too long after. It was drawn first by La Mettrie, then it was about a century later, half a century later, and it was considered totally outrageous. In fact, his work hasn't been revived until this century. La Mettrie was driven out, he's a doctor, and his argument was, look, thought must be just a property of organized matter, because there isn't anything else. And he was driven out of France, driven out of Holland. He finally survived thanks to the protection of Frederick the Great for some reason. About a generation later, in more tolerant England, the same idea was developed by the eminent chemist Joseph Priestley, a major 18th century scientist, who argued that, I can find his quotes, he argued, I'm quoting him now, that thought in humans is a property of the brain. It's a necessary result of a certain organization. It's like electricity, magnetism, and the powers of attraction and repulsion. That's what he compared it to. Nobody really understood those things. But whatever electricity, magnetism, and the powers of attraction and repulsion are, these ghostly properties that matter has, thought is just another one of them. It's another one of those ghostly properties, and we have to investigate it in these terms. Another 18th century version is that the brain secretes thought, the way the liver secretes bile. This is kind of the image. Actually, if you look at people like John Searle today, he seems to be saying something more or less similar to that, if I understand him correctly. Well, that looks like the right move, mainly because there's no other choice. There doesn't seem to be any other move you could make. I mean, since all there is a world which has ghostly properties all the way down to elementary dynamics, there's nothing to say except that properties of attraction, propulsion, and electricity, and magnetism, and later on quantum effects, and thought, and whatever else is around, anything that's going on, is just some property of the world, some property of the way matter is organized, or where matter now has no meaning, it's just whatever there is. Some property of how whatever there is organized has these features. And a naturalistic approach to humans ought to proceed that way. Well, that leads us to the next question. How can organized matter have these properties? Well, on that question, progress has been essentially zero. We don't know we have nothing to say about how organized matter can have such properties as the creative aspect of language use. In that respect, we're exactly as much in the dark as the Cartesians were. It's not that matter and mind are different kinds of things. That can't be, because there doesn't seem to be any such kind of thing as matter. So therefore, matter and mind can't be different kinds of things, there being no matter. So they're not different kinds of things, but if we think of those terms as descriptive conveniences, describing certain aspects of the world, namely humans above the neck versus everything else, then it seems that matter and mind pose different kinds of problems to human intelligence. That appears to be the case. Maybe they'll be shown to be wrong. Like there was a time when electricity and magnetism, and for that matter universal gravitation, also posed total mysteries. Maybe we just haven't learned enough. But for now, it seems reasonable to suppose that matter and mind, though not different kind of things, do pose different kind of problems to human intelligence. Well, if that turns out to be true, it would not be in the least surprising to a naturalist. Remember, a naturalist perspective assumes that humans are just part of the world, not angels. They're just another thing in the world. If they're a thing in the world, they're going to have certain cognitive capacity, like rats. I mean, a rat can do certain things, and it can't do other things. I mean, it's very lucky for a rat that it can't do lots of things, because if it wasn't incapable of doing lots and lots of things, it wouldn't be capable of doing anything. There's a logical relation between scope and limits. If you have the capacity If you don't lack capacity to do many things, you can't have the capacity to do anything. Very simple reason. The capacity to do something requires articulated structure. And if you have articulated structure, it's going to rule out all sorts of other things. I mean, the point is obvious in the case of physical growth. An embryo has particular genetic instructions, very rich genetic instructions, which are going to allow it to become a chicken. But that very structure is going to prevent it from becoming a monkey. Okay? So lucky for a chicken that it lacks the capacity to become a monkey, because if it didn't lack that capacity, it couldn't become a chicken. And the same thing, assuming a naturalistic, assuming that the world doesn't change somehow when you move to cognitive function, the same thing's going to be true about cognitive function. So rats happen to be very good at solving what are called radial mazes. A thing like this, where you stick the rat in the middle, and it's got food out here. These are kind of like spokes of the wheel, and the trick is to learn how to go down each path exactly once. Like, remember, you didn't move down that path before. And in order to make it as hard as possible, the experimenter will rotate the thing so the rat can't sing olfactory cues, remembering he smelled his way down there or something. Rats turn out to solve that very fast, probably faster than humans. So they're really good at radial mazes, but they're horrible at other mazes. So, for example, if you take, say, a right, left maze, turn right, turn left, turn left. Rats can't do it at all. But if they can, it's certainly extremely hard. Humans can do it quite easily. If you were to, say, set up a prime number maze where a rat has to turn right every prime number of branch points, obviously the rat would never do it in a million years. And the reason is it just doesn't have that concept in its head. A rat can do a lot of things we can do, like it can build a nest and find its way home and solve radial mazes and all sorts of things, because it has special capacities. But it can't do things like a right, left maze, which humans can do. And as I say, it's kind of lucky for a rat that it can't do all these things, because that means it has the structure to do other things. Well, if humans are part of it, just to introduce some terminology, we might distinguish for a rat between what we could call problems and let's call it mysteries. And by problems for a rat, I mean areas of challenges, say intellectual challenges, that can in principle be resolved within the rat's cognitive space. It's got the concepts for it. It may take a long time, but it's got the concepts for it. By mysteries, I mean things that are just outside its cognitive space altogether, like a prime number maze or probably a right, left maze. Okay. The analogy in say, embryology would be that becoming a chicken is a problem for a chicken embryo. Becoming a monkey is a mystery. It just hasn't got the capacity to do it. You can't change the nutritional environment of the cell in order to make a chicken a monkey, Actually, nobody knows that. It's just taken for granted. I mean, rational people looking at the world just assume that. They have no real knowledge of it, to explain it. It's just sort of so obvious, nobody even talks about it. I'll come back to that fact, because it's interesting that in the study of cognitive development, people aren't rational that way, the way they are in embryology. That's part of the epistemological dualism I'll come back to. Anyhow, in the areas where we can all be rational without too much trouble, like chicken embryos and rats, the distinction between problems and mysteries is quite clear. Notice it doesn't have to be a sharp distinction. It could be graded, and there could be all sorts of other dimensions and so on. But as a first approximation, it makes sense to distinguish these two categories. And it may even be very sharp. Well, if humans are part of the natural world, the same is going to be true of humans. That is, there'll be problems, there'll be mysteries. There'll be intellectual challenges that are within our cognitive reach, at least in principle. And there'll be others that are just not within our cognitive reach, in principle. And if that is true, if there are certain things we can't understand, we should be very happy about it, because that's a consequence of the fact that we can't understand anything at all. for just reasons of logic, same as a chicken embryo. Well, in theory, we can find out something about this. I mean, looking at ourselves from abstracting from our skins and looking back at ourselves, we could carry out an investigation that might set the boundaries of those things. For example, we might discover that there are certain kinds of intellectual constructions that humans are capable of setting up. Like humans, if you look at science, let's say, there are certain ideas that keep cropping up. Like we can study input-output systems. We can study deterministic systems. We can study probabilistic systems. We can study systems with a random element. There's a number of things we can do. And if something can be put into those frameworks, we can deal with it. On the other hand, it may very well be that the creative aspect of language use just doesn't have those properties. It's an aspect of the world that just lacks those properties, exactly as the Cartesians thought, in which case it would just be a mystery for us. Free will, in other words. The same might be true of the problem of consciousness. And in fact, all the old chestnuts, all the questions everybody's been worrying about for thousands of years, where you never make any progress at all. I mean, literally zero. People don't even have bad ideas about it. Like on some areas, you have bad ideas. But in these topics, you don't even have bad ideas. It just looks like you're bumping into a blank wall. I mean, you know as well as you know anything that you're aware of some things, not of others. You know as well as you know anything that you have a range of freedom of choice of action. You can choose other than what is impelled by you. You know that the Cartesians were right in saying that whereas a machine is compelled, the human is only incited and inclined and could decide to resist those inclinations. You just know that as much as you know anything. And it just looks like a total mystery. There isn't any idea, however bad, as to how that might happen. I mean, there are ideas about quantum mechanics and so on, but they don't even reach the level of bad ideas because they always introduce random elements. And we know that this is not random, no more random than it's determined. It's somehow appropriate, but not random. In fact, it's just uncaused. Not uncaused in the sense of random, but uncaused in the sense of undetermined but appropriate. And what that means, nobody has any idea. We can recognize it. We have no problem recognizing it. We can pick it out all the time. In fact, pretty easily. We have the foggiest idea what it is. Well, it could be that we're facing something like right, left maze for a rat. In other words, it could turn out to be true that the domain of the mental for humans is just a mystery, and hence not metaphysically different, because there are no metaphysical differences, but epistemologically different. Part of our mystery space, not our problem space. There's actually a book coming out by an Oxford philosopher now at Rutgers, named Colin McGinn, who arguing that it's impressive that philosophy is just the study of mysteries in this sense. That's why philosophy is hard, because it's the study of mysteries. You can never make any progress. Actually, there's a traditional view of philosophy which would make it almost tautological. One traditional view of philosophy is that it was what's called the mother of the sciences, meaning things are philosophy as long as you don't understand them. As soon as you begin to understand them, they become science. Then philosophers don't worry about them anymore. So in the contemporary period, say, people like John Austin, Oxford philosopher, strongly advocated that. And the person who developed the theory of speech act. And he argued that he was, Oxford philosopher, but he said what he was working in was pre-science, the theory of speech act. And whenever it came to be understood enough, it would go off and become part of the sciences, and then they wouldn't talk about it in Oxford common rooms anymore. They'd really work on it, Well, if that's what philosophy is, the mother of the sciences, then by definition it's the study of mysteries, So its problems really are kind of hard in some special sense. Now, notice that what's a mystery for a rat may not be a mystery for us, and conversely. So the notion of problem and mystery is organism dependent. It's just a fact about particular organisms. Okay, so it's really problem and mystery sub, we're some organism. There's no absolute sense in which something's a mystery, presumably. Like, it could be a Martian for whom what's a mystery to us is trivial. Maybe he's watching us all the time and wondering why we always make the same dumb mistake when we study mental phenomena, just as we can watch a rat and wonder why it always makes the same dumb mistake and it's running a right, left maze. And we think the mysteries of the Martian might be trivial to us. There's no commensurability necessary in this space. But nevertheless, it's something like that. Something like that has to be true from a naturalistic point of view. That is, again, if humans aren't angels, if it's part of the natural world, then this is going to be true. Now, we don't know what the boundary is, but we know it's there. And in fact, coming back to the question of the natural sciences, it would seem that the natural sciences are sort of an accidental convergence, purely chance convergence between some properties of the world and properties of our cognitive space. So somehow, by some pure accident, it turned out that if this is the properties of the world and this is a set of things that are just problems for humans, there's some area of convergence in there. There's no reason why that has to be like that, you know. And there's a long discussion in the sciences or philosophy of science trying to argue that it had to be like that. I think this goes back first to Charles Sanders Peirce about a century ago in the early post-Darwinian period. Peirce argued that he asked, scientists have always been asking the question, how come science is so successful? It's kind of a miracle, you know. Like Einstein, not foolish scientists. Einstein asked the question, how come, you know, the human mind is capable of understanding the nature of reality? Well, of course, that presupposes that humans are capable of understanding the nature of reality. And the evidence for that is very slight. I mean, in fact, what seems to be the case is that through the general obscurity, there's a few little points of light that have broken through, and that's what we call science. But most of the questions that the Greeks asked, let's say, are just as obscure today as they were then. You know, I mean, a few of them, you know, a very small number of them have been answered. So, first of all, the fact to be explained doesn't seem to be a fact. The fact that humans have this amazing capacity to understand the nature of the world just doesn't seem to be true. Most of what's going on, we haven't a glimmer of understanding about. So since the fact isn't a fact, we really don't care what the explanations for it are. But the explanations that have been offered from Charles Sanders Peirce up to people like Stephen Hawking in his recent popular book on time are always the same mistaken explanation. Namely that the reason for this fact, which is not a fact, is evolution. Evolution selected us to be able to solve problems. Therefore, we're able to solve problems. But that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, there was nothing in the history of the human species that gave a reproductive advantage to ability to solve problems in number theory, let's say, or in quantum theory. In fact, human evolution took place in hunter-gatherer societies. Nothing happens instead. And there's no reproductive advantage, even in modern societies, certainly in hunter-gatherer societies. There's no reproductive advantage to the capacity to solve problems in the advanced sciences. I mean, sort of triviality. And that's all evolution's about. It's just about reproductive advantage, not of anything else. In fact, it's even been, serious evolutionary biologists have been trying to ridicule these notions for years, have even argued only half jokingly that there's a selective advantage for stupidity. Dick Lewontin, who's one of the best population geneticists at Harvard, one of the main modern evolutionary biologists, trying to debunk all kinds of stories about cognitive development and so on, suggested that if you really look back at hunter-gatherer societies, where all of human evolution took place, and if you consider the people who, for some genetic reason, we're more adventurous or more imaginative or whatever, chances are they'll get killed, although they'll be good for the tribe. That is, while all the dumb, unimaginative guys are sitting around the fire, this imaginative guy is going to be out trying to figure out a way to catch the saber-toothed tiger, you know. Well, you know, maybe he'll succeed now and then, in which case it's good for everybody sitting around the fire. But over time, it tends to be bad for him because he often fails, and the saber-toothed tiger gets him, you know. So there's a reproductive advantage to being passive, stupid, unimaginative, and so on. And therefore, he argues, well, there ought to be a tendency in that direction. As I say, this is only half serious. Not entirely unserious, incidentally. But merely an effort to debunk the idea that you can learn anything about the evolution of cognition. Dick Lawton's major point is nothing within any, you know, scope that we can dream of. There's nothing possible that anybody will ever be able to say about the evolution of the language faculty or the evolution of cognition, and certainly not the evolution of the science-forming faculty. It's just hopeless. It's got to be just some physical configuration that took place for whatever reason. And I think that's correct. That doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of work on it, but the work looks vacuous for those kinds of reasons. In any event, it looks as if it's reasonable to suggest that science, as we know it, is just a kind of ray of light which accidentally happens to break through because of some chance convergence between our problem space, which is part of our nature, and the world, which is whatever it is. And already by the 17th century, big paradoxes were arising because our problem space is sort of wedded to the mechanical philosophy, and we had to give it up and move to some other parts of our mind which have whatever properties they have, which may be systematically misleading us and may be leading us away from inquiry into the mental. Now, in the post-Newtonian era, if this is, suppose this is true, suppose that certain aspects of the mental, like, say, creative aspect of language use, the litmus test for the mental, for the Cartesians, so not something trivial. Suppose that really turns out to be, in fact, a mystery for humans. Well, we're just stuck with it. You know, that's the way we are. We're stuck with it the way we're stuck with the moon illusion. And maybe it's a problem not only for our perceptual space, but even for a mystery, but even for our cognitive space, in which case we'll never have any understanding of it, just as we have no understanding of most problems. That doesn't mean we can't deal with these things in our normal lives. Like in our normal lives, we're always dealing with things, more or less successfully, that we haven't any conception of. You know, we do it by what's called intuition, which is just a name for what we can do, but without any understanding of how we're doing it. And virtually everything that goes on is by intuition. Fortunately, we've got all these capacities, whatever they may be. But to gain a scientific understanding of them is something else. That we will ever be able to do so is, I think, kind of unlikely. And in fact, you might even argue it's a good thing. You know, it's nice that we don't understand ourselves too well. Could be awful if we did understand ourselves too well. But anyhow, it just looks plausible to assume that most of our humans above the neck just never understand. We can begin to pick particular, we'll be able to do it, do all kind of things, but we probably won't be able to understand it, at least so it looks. And certain aspects of the mental appear to look like that. They just appear to be in the mystery space. Again, that could be wrong, but let me stress again that this could be a research topic. You could imagine, investigate, in fact, it could come out of cognitive science. It could come out of cognitive science that humans are capable of constructing certain kinds of conceptual structures, like determinism and randomness, say. And those are going to deal with certain types of phenomena. And if you can show empirically that certain arrays of phenomena don't have those properties, too bad. Then you're in the mystery space. That's conceivable discovery about human beings, conceivable empirical discovery. Without paradox, we could discover what's a mystery for us. We couldn't solve it, but we could find it, find out where it is. And a large part of the so-called mind-body problem, could ultimately fall into that area. Again, not metaphysical, because we can't state it. Well, with metaphysical dualism unstatable, is there another kind of dualism? Remember, metaphysical dualism falls within naturalism. It's just a form that naturalistic inquiry takes. It reaches metaphysical dualism along the lines, say, that the Cartesians followed, and then it's exploded because the world disappears. The machine disappears. So we're left without any form of metaphysical dualism. We have no matter anymore. Is there any other kind of dualism that we can construct? Well, the only other kind is irrational dualism, epistemological dualism, which says you're just not allowed to study humans or humans above the neck by the methods of rational inquiry. You're not allowed to study humans naturalistically. Now, as distinct from metaphysical dualism, this is a completely irrational position, as far as I can see. It has no saving graces at all. What I want to show, I guess I'll stop now and come back to that, is that however irrational it may be, it's pervasive. In fact, it dominates, and in fact, maybe even almost universally dominates the more reflective, more considered aspects of the cognitive sciences. By that I mean contemporary philosophy of mind, contemporary philosophy of language, artificial intelligence, debates about the limits of machines, can software be think, all that kind of stuff. What I want to try to argue is that all of this is ultimately, if you look at it closely, at each point, it's a departure from a naturalistic approach to humans, meaning it's a form of epistemological dualism, hence irrational dualism, unless you can give an argument for it. There might be an argument for treating humans non-naturalistically, but the burden of proof is on anyone who suggests that. And you will wait an argument, in other words. If you don't get one, you forget about it. That's what I'd like to argue, and to the extent that that's plausible, the last question, which I'll come back to at the end, is why. I have to show that it's plausible. But assuming that it's plausible, why would it be true? Well, there would be a natural explanation, namely that intuitively we are just dualists. We can't help being dualists any more than we can help seeing the sunset. We see the sunset no matter how much we know, and probably our approach to the world, humans, is just, ineradicably dualist. We see humans as having ghostly minds in a physical body, and even if the notion physical body disappears, we can't help seeing people that way. Just as once contact mechanics has disappeared, and once the Ptolemaic universe has disappeared, we can't help seeing the sunset. Now, with metaphysical dualism, if this is true as an aspect of human cognitive character, if metaphysical dualism is on a par with the setting of the sun, just a way we can't help looking at things, with metaphysical dualism gone, we're forced to irrational dualism. But it's a path we should resist. That's the diagnosis I'd like to give at the end, but first we have to traverse the path. So I'll stop here. Very polite.
Any questions? Yeah, any questions? The microphone here.
At the beginning of the lecture, you were careful in distinguishing between two levels of cognitive time. There are certain levels of cognitive time that appears unequally experimentally inquiry into certain cognitive capacities that is characterized by certain properties, certain computational or representational approach, and so on and so forth. And a second level, which is what's called more reflective or second order cognitive science. And that is, you think so, on science with no further qualification would perhaps more apply to stress now that the criticism that you express only refer to one aspect, not to the other.
That's correct.
I think it's fair to say that looking at the first level of science from German geography.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. No, I completely agree with that, and I think it's worth stressing. So in the actual inquiries, say into vision or sensory perception or language and the stuff we work on, there have been real breakthroughs. I mean, I think really revolutionary breakthroughs. They're considered in, it's this second level cognitive science, the kind you could call philosophy of mind. In fact, they're pretty much the same field. That's the one I'm talking about. And strikingly, actual working cognitive scientists tend to be sort of schizophrenic about this issue. I mean, some of them don't think about the general topics at all. But those who do think about the general topic, which is normal, and reasonable, I'm not suggesting everybody think about reflectively about what they're doing. Like, not many chemists think about what chemistry is about. They just do it. But in those among the cognitive scientists who think about the topic, they generally, in my opinion, move to the irrational side when they're thinking about it. So somebody may do work in which they, use computational representational models of, say, vision, and then they may argue that this doesn't make any sense. Incidentally, that's not something unknown in the history of the more advanced sciences. Maybe some of you can, I'm sure some of you know way more about this than I do, so add things that I don't know. But, as you may know, one of my colleagues at MIT up until recently was Tom Kuhn, down the hall, who's a well-known historian of science. And I have been we've been friends for years, and I've been interested in exploring with him similar things in the natural sciences. And interestingly, it hasn't been studied much. He couldn't refer me to any literature on it. So, if you ask the question, how did this transition go from, say, Poincaré regarding the molecular theory of gases as just a computational device to people assuming there really are molecules, there's a whole bunch of things like that. He couldn't refer me to any literature, actually only one study, an unpublished study, or how in Newton's period, which has been heavily studied, how did people get from regarding universal gravitation as an occult property, which no sane person could even dream of, which was Newton's point of view, to recognizing it as just obvious, and by the time you get to, Laplace or somebody. How did that transition take place? There doesn't seem to be much work on that. And I think that's right at the heart, exactly where we're in, The one study that Kuhn referred me to is a book, actually a dissertation by a guy named John Heilbrunn, who was actually a student of his, who did a doctoral dissertation on the things like the molecular theory of gases, on the transition around the turn of the century from a period in which molecules and atoms and so on were regarded as just computing devices. Like Poincaré said, we use them because we're familiar with billiards. We just want to get the answers. Up to the point where people really just assume they're there. There really are molecules. And according to this guy, if you go back to, say, 1880, scientists were completely schizophrenic, just like cognitive science started today. I mean, when they were doing their work, they treated molecules as being as concrete as Bunsen burners, no distinction. On the other hand, when they were thinking about it, they said it's total nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. There can't be such things. Field, molecule, any of this kind of business. These are just ways of coming up with the right answer, kind of very operational. And then he says that you go there's about a 10, 20-year period from about 1890 to 1910 when attitudes just shift totally. And by, say, 1910, people just talk about them as being like Bunsen burners. I mean, later, comes quantum theory and new problems arise. But in that period, like this period, people just thought of them very, substantively. And his argument, his reconstruction is that what happened basically is that, for example, lots of different ways of calculating the number of molecules in a certain volume of gas, lots of different ways of doing that converge, giving you very close to the same number. And there were all kinds of convergence of this kind. And the convergences were just so powerful, along with the elegance of the theories that were coming out, that at some point it just became unreasonable to question it, no matter how much wrench it was with common sense. Well, in my opinion, it'd be nice to understand this better in the natural sciences, because it might give some hints, as to where we're being caught in traps and things. If you look at what happened in places where they've already been through this a long time ago. My impression is that in the cognitive sciences today, there's something similar going on. So that in the actual work, the first level cognitive science, people are doing perfectly sensible work and making advances and so on and so forth. When people are thinking about that work, including often the very same people who are doing it, it sort of flies off to outer space based on illusions. And it's that second level of cognitive science, the philosophy of mind part, that I really am talking about now.
I have two questions to ask. The first one is in the consideration of the computational properties of the mind, just in the period of Descartes. Besides the automata, maybe it was an influence of considering mathematics as a computational mean, as a language. Do you think that it has an importance, the consideration of mathematics as a computational language, also in that time?
At that time? Well, of course, Descartes is famous for analytic geometry, basically, giving a numerical interpretation of geometry. I don't know if at that time there was anything like a real conception of mathematics as a formal system in our sense.
No.
That didn't really come till Hilbert, way later. I mean, we were right through the 19th century. Classical analysis was just some kind of hand-waving. So, Gauss couldn't have explained intelligibly what he was doing. It didn't really get what we call formalized until mid-19th century. And so I don't know. But my impression is that those ideas were not influential in the first cognitive revolution. I mean, what formalized mathematics meant at that time was Euclid, which was pretty close to formalized, though, as Hilbert pointed out, when he redid it properly, there were lots of gaps, But, that was the model of formalization, and that model didn't really give you a notion of formal language or anything like that. In the mid-20th century, very influential and extremely harmful in my point of view, I believe. Now, actually, it's double-edged. Like the concept of the concepts of formalization that led to the notion of recursive procedure, like, say, Turing machine and so on, that was very productive. I mean, it made it possible to face classical problems in a clear way for the first time. On the other hand, the idea of formal language, I think that's extremely misleading. Virtually all of Quine's work, for example, on natural language, seems to me to be derived, I'll come back to this, from a model of formal arithmetic, which has no resemblance whatsoever to natural language. Doesn't have any of the same properties. And the conclusions that are drawn from the study of formal arithmetic are totally irrelevant. I mean, formal arithmetic begins by stipulating a class of well-formed formulas. I'll come back to this in more detail, but just think of, say, I'll talk about Quine particularly because it's absolutely, beyond any measure, the most influential modern philosopher in this area. Tremendous impact. And if you look back at thinking about natural language and about psychology, it comes from a model which starts like this. It says, let's take formal arithmetic. Okay, how does it work? We stipulate a class of symbols. we construct certain mathematical objects, which are strings of these things. We then select a certain infinite set of those mathematical objects. We call them the well-formed formulas. We then pick any recursive procedure we like to generate that set. We call it an axiom system. The axiom system is completely free. We can pick any one we like. We do it for convenience or something. The only thing that has any reality is the class of well-formed formulas. That has reality because we stipulate it. Like we could stipulate the class of even numbers or something and then pick any method of generating them we like. The method of generating them is irrelevant. You know, you just use whatever one you feel like. The thing that's real is the set extensionally. Now, he approaches natural language the same way. He says what's uncontroversial is the class of well-formed formulas. What's problematic is what's called the grammar, the generative procedure that characterizes them. In fact, he argues crucially that to say that one grammar rather than another is the true grammar is like saying that one axiom system rather than another is the right axiom system for arithmetic. Well, that would obviously be ridiculous in the case of arithmetic. So therefore, by analogy, it's ridiculous in the case of natural language. And that, as soon as you make that move, you're off into some totally non-naturalistic direction. And the trouble is you can't make the first step. There's nothing in natural language analogous to the class of well-formed formulas. It doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is the generative procedure. The thing that doesn't exist in formal arithmetic does exist in natural language, and conversely. So it seems to me that the analogy has been extremely misleading from the first moment on. You know, although the concept of generative procedure itself has been has been crucial. You know, made it possible to study for the first time things that people could only wave their hands at before. This has had for the linguists among you, it had a terrible effect in linguistics. From about 1970 up till today, as the linguists all know, there's been a huge debate about the generative capacity of different kinds of grammatical theories. You know, like, do they generate all recursively enumerable sets? Or can we cut them down so that they generate only recursive sets? Or can we cut them down so they have only the capacity of context-free grammars, which is supposed to be a big ideal that you're supposed to try to reach? And in fact, a lot of the argument against so-called transformational grammar, since work by Stan Peters, or even earlier, Hilary Putnam, has been that it's too broad and weak generative capacity. It generates too many sets, it generates wild sets. You know? And we don't want that. We want to generate only non-wild sets. And now this, I call this a debate, but it's really one-sided, because only one position is represented in the debate. Those who think it's a problem. The other side, which is basically me, isn't participating because there's no problem, there's no question. There's no question. You can't talk about generative capacity unless you have a class of well-formed formulas. And there is no such thing. Nobody's ever told us what it is. You know. Nor is there any gap in linguistic theory that would be filled if you had such a concept. I mean, it's not that there's a kind of a theory out here and, you know, there's some things we'd like to explain, and if we could only figure out this concept, we could explain them. That's not true. I mean, there's nothing around which we would understand any better if somebody specified the class of well-formed formulas, and furthermore, nobody knows how to do it. Furthermore, every working linguist, here to get back to Luigi's point, every working linguist knows, at least on one side of his brain, that it doesn't make any sense, because working linguists are typically working in areas of relative judgment. Like most productive work has to do with things like the differences between subjacency deviations and ECP deviations, you know, two kinds of deviation. That's, you know, what's going to be useful evidence. You never know in advance. It's usually something very exotic, not what's in front of you. And that evidence turns out, for all kinds of theoretical reasons, to be extremely illuminating. Or it takes the study of parasitic gaps, certain kind of constructions, which are very odd. You know, when you tell them to people, they kind of cringe, although they interpret them in very special ways. Now, you know, the ways they interpret them are extremely illuminating. In fact, precisely because they're very odd. They're very odd because nobody ever hears them. So any way they're interpreting is something that's coming out of their minds, you know. So they happen to be very interesting, but they're all deviant. Well, are they well-formed or aren't they well-formed? Well, it's a stupid question. You know, they have exactly the status they have. You know, the status they have is deviant in this respect. There is no notion of self-permanence. Now, every working linguist knows that in their bones. You know, no one has ever proposed a vague idea what the classical well-formed formulas might be. There's no gap in linguistic theory that is asking to be filled by this concept. In other words, the concept has all the earmarks